Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, where we talk about UFOs and other weird wonders in the world. I'm Jimmy Coe, your host.
And this is Stephen Hawk, the other host.
What are we doing tonight?
I'm glad everyone was here to join us. Before we get started, I would like to remind everybody to rate and review the show if you like what you've been hearing. It bumps us up and allows other people to find the show. We are just amazed by how many people have found this show, even though I'm not sure how you found it, but I'm glad you did. We've been getting all kinds of downloads, and we just thank you for listening and tuning in and subscribing. We are just thrilled by it. Please reach out to the show at firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com and just say hello. And if you have a story to tell, some type of extraordinary encounter, then please reach out and let us know if you'd like us to share it on the show. That would be fantastic. If you want to remain anonymous, that's perfectly fine. Just let us know in the email that you want to do that. If you find any kind of mistakes or disagree with us or find more information that we didn't cover, share that with us too. Be sure to check out our Facebook page, our Instagram, and our webpage, cosmicsponge.com. You'll find all kinds of fun and interesting things there. So with all that out of the way, Jimmy, what have you been up to this week?
Not a whole lot. I mean, I have been following the news, but the one thing I want to bring up this week is actually a story from back in 2019, I think is when I first heard about it. There was film footage shot in 2016 of what appears to be a tic-tac UFO in Utah. It was shot on a drone camera as some filmmakers were doing some landscape captures for a documentary. It wasn't until they got back to their hotel room and they were downloading the footage, reviewing it, that they noticed that there was this object coming out of the valley about 3.5 miles away and zoomed past the camera of the drone at this amazing speed, so fast that they didn't see it. They were nearby. They didn't see this object, but it showed up on the camera. Now, initially, skeptics were saying that it was a bug, but they released the raw footage, and somebody took the time, and you can go to our Facebook page and see the link to a YouTube channel that's run by a Brian Hanley, who's been on top of this story. The raw footage was released. Lots of people went in there to check it out to see whether they could debunk it or explain what was going on. Initially, people thought it was a bug. But somebody did a lot of research, a lot of math, a lot of estimations, and pretty much ruled out the bug, I think. Pretty compelling.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I watched that after you posted it. I had never really heard of it. It is pretty amazing footage. The only thing I will say is in today's world with CGI and pretty cheap ways of doing computer graphics, that would be the only thing I think it would be other than a legitimate video. Now, I don't think it's a bug or any kind of misidentification at all. Whoever the individual was in this YouTube video that Jimmy posted really broke it down, shows why this can't be a bug, because it goes behind the trees, behind a hill, and it comes back up. You lose sight of it again behind the trees, and you can just see the object through the trees. And if it is CGI, somebody done an amazing job on it. So, yeah, it's very intriguing. It is a very, very interesting video. And as Jimmy said, we have this on our Facebook page, and we invite you to go to Cosmic Sponge on Facebook and take a look at this video. If anything, just check it out. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and let us know what you think. We really would love some feedback on this because I don't really know what to make of it. I was really happy with the bug explanation. Now I'm left wondering, what on earth could it be if it's not a bug?
It could be a reasonable explanation, but I watched it several times, and to me, it looks pretty amazing. Maybe CGI, I don't know.
There's a lot of CGI stuff out there, so you got to be careful. Anyway, yeah. That's my news item for the week.
I told listeners last week that I was going to try and do some follow-up on the alien autopsy. So the auction, in case you missed it, there is one 16mm frame being sold from the alien autopsy film that was aired on Fox years ago called Alien Autopsy Fact or Fiction, and it is supposed to depict an alien from the Roswell crash in 1947 being autopsied, being cut apart and examined. The film's pretty much been debunked, and there's still some believers out there that are into this thing because the man that acquired this film is a man named Ray Santilli. Of course, he said it was a legitimate film, but admitted years later that what he says now is that he saw an original film and that, yes, that film that you saw on Fox was a reenactment or a reconstruction of the original film, but the original film was very degraded, and that some of the frames that you saw on Alien Autopsy Fact or Fiction contain some of the original frames from the original film. That's his story. And of course, there's been some people who come forward later and say, hey, I filmed this thing, a special effects guy in some London apartment. Anyway, just did a little bit of follow-up, because one thing that Mr. Santilli is saying is that the CIA had validated the film, that it was real, but there's a lot more to it than that. There was Kit Green, whose name has come up on this podcast before, is somewhat well known in the UFO circles. Apparently used to be a scientist that worked in the CIA, maybe was part of the CIA, claims he saw a real alien autopsy film and photographs, and says that the alien autopsy film that they have looks like what he remembered the real alien autopsy film looked like when he was in the CIA. So that's where that memo came from, that apparently was sent to Robert Bigelow in Nevada, head of Bigelow Aerospace. There's more to the story than that, but just to let you know, I said I would follow up on it. So there's no declassified CIA document that you can find on a real government website like the National Archive thing. This is a leaked memo or something like that.
A fabricated memo.
But if you wish to own that frame of film, it is still available. I'm on the website looking at it right now, and I imagine in 2 weeks' time, whenever this airs, it'll still be available.
Nobody snatched it up, huh?
There's 0 bids on it. I do know that $1 million is the reserve for one authentic 16-millimeter film frame of the Alien Autopsy Fact or Fiction film. So there you go.
When it gets down to 250,000, call me.
Yeah. There's a little bit more to that story, listeners. If you all want to follow up on that, then more power to you. I'm sure you can go down as many rabbit holes as you want with the alien autopsy. The other piece that I wanted to share, and this also is on our Facebook page, I ran across a pretty interesting UFO report coming out of Russia. This one is just totally different than what we get in the United States. The official TASS news agency said today that scientists have confirmed the landing of an alien spaceship carrying giant people with tiny heads. What do you think about that? I mean, it's usually the other way around, right? I mean, usually you got the tiny people with the giant heads and the giant eyes. So leave it to the Russians to have something completely different.
I don't even know what to do with that.
Scientists have, and this, scientists have confirmed that an unidentified flying object recently landed in a park in the Russian city of Voronezh, I think. And butchering the hell out of that, so sorry.
Your Russian sucks.
I can't speak Russian. I can't even pretend to speak Russian. They have also identified the landing site and found traces of aliens who made a short promenade around the park. Residents saw a large shining ball or disc hovering over the park. They reported that the UFO landed and up to 3 creatures similar to humans emerged, accompanied by a small robot. The aliens were 3 or even 4 meters, and for us Americans, that's 9 to 12 feet tall, but all of our European friends obviously know what 3 to 4 meters are, and Canadians, and everybody else in the world. Okay. But with very small heads. They walked near the ball or disc and then disappeared inside. They said they resembled a man, but taller than average, with short legs and only a small knob instead of a head.
I'm sorry.
They got over there and took some soil samples. They said additional tests needed to be done on the trace elements.
I'm not sure that additional tests need to be done on the trace elements. Additional tests need to be done on the witnesses.
TASS also reported that residents had recently reported banana-shaped objects in the sky.
I can't do this.
However, there were some local firefighters that said that the 26-foot wide patch of burned ground near southern Moscow was probably caused by, they're saying it was probably caused by a UFO, but the firefighter said it was just a haystack that caught fire and scorched the ground.
It's a government cover.
It is. Those firefighters, man, they're probably really undercover KGB or whatever their equivalent is for the KGB now. I don't know.
I love that story. That's a great way to wrap up the week.
Anyway, if you want to know more, that story is on the Cosmic Sponge Facebook page. Be sure and check it out. So what we are going to do now is move on to our main... Unless you got anything else, Jimmy. You got anything else going on?
I think that's more than enough for me for the week.
Kind of topped it? Okay. Yeah.
Little knobs for heads.
All right, so let's move on to, before Jimmy completely loses it, let's move on to our main topic. So tonight what we're talking about is the Japanese airliner, flight number 1628. This is also known as the Anchorage incident, and that is where a Japanese Airlines 747 cargo plane encountered a UFO over Alaska. And Jimmy, I think you've done the legwork on this one.
My little legs have been running on this one. All right.
So why don't you give us the rundown and tell us what happened with this incident?
Let me get a drink to clear my throat.
What do you have in that fancy goblet you're sipping from tonight?
It's a Chardonnay again.
The Chardonnay. You know, I don't know anything about wine. Like, what type of wines do you, different activities, like what's the deal? Like, what kind of wine would you take with you, say, if you were going out to search for Bigfoot over the weekend?
A Bigfoot? Probably a Malbec or a heavy cab blend.
What about Ripple or Boone's Farm?
I think those are probably a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
Do you think they would be appropriate?
Do they come in a box?
I'm not aware. They may come in a box. I don't know. I'm not a wine connoisseur as you are.
I'm not a wine connoisseur.
But I do know they have a screw on top so that you can reseal it if you haven't quite finished, your
Hey, that's
wine.
perfectly great for white wines. It's fine. It's fine.
Any white wine's good for a Bigfoot hunt.
That's right. You know what? It's funny that we're talking about wine because it comes into this story, believe it or not.
Oh, that's right. It does.
It does.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
Should we start?
Yes, please.
This is the kind of wine that you get with a UFO story in Alaska. On November 17th, 1986, Japan Airlines flight...
wait a minute.
What?
Should we have some dramatic music here?
We should definitely have some dramatic music. Cue the dramatic music. On November 17th, 1986, Japan Airlines Flight 1628 was traveling on the second leg of its journey to deliver a cargo of Beaujolais wine from Paris, France, to the thirsty citizens on the island nation of Japan. After a stopover at Reykjavik, Iceland, the Boeing 747-200F cargo aircraft continued on to Anchorage, Alaska. On board was Captain Tara Uchi, ex-fighter pilot with over 10,000 hours in the air. In the seat to his right, First Officer Takanori Tamafuji, the main source of communications with the control tower later on in our story. And finally, Second Officer and Flight Engineer Yoshio Tsukuba, relegated to the back seat with next to no view to the sky ahead. At 5:11 p.m. over eastern Alaska, the crew first witnessed two unidentified objects to their left. These abruptly rose from approximately 2,000 feet below them and closed in, seemingly to escort their aircraft. Each had two rectangular arrays of what appeared to be glowing nozzles or thrusters. However, the shape of the crafts remained obscured by darkness. When closest, the cabin of the 747 was lit up, and the captain could feel the heat from the unknown craft on his face. Eventually, the two craft departed before a third, much larger disc-shaped object approximately the size of two aircraft carriers appeared and began to follow them. Though the crew members were unable to see the object once it fell back to their left, a military air controller at Elmendorf Air Force Base was able to get a primary radar contact of something keeping pace just behind them. Two other flights in the area were instructed to observe Flight 1628 to see if they could identify any other craft nearby, but the captains of those flights indicated the Japanese airliner was alone. The rest of the flight was uneventful, and JAL 1628 landed safely at Anchorage Airport, the time 16:20 p.m. After landing, the crew was interviewed. A report was compiled, and the event was all but forgotten by the FAA. It wasn't until a story out of Japan was picked up by media outlets in the United States in late December that news of the incident spread globally, and the FAA was compelled to take a fresh look. All the data of the flight was then sent to the FAA Technical Center in Atlantic City under the direction of John Callahan, the Division Chief of Accidents, Evaluations, and Investigations in Washington, D.C. The data was reviewed by his superior, Harvey Saphir. Once the analysis was compiled, Callahan and Saphir briefed FAA Administrator Vice Admiral Donald D. Egan. After viewing the full video presentation, Egan scheduled a briefing which included representatives from the FBI, CIA, and presidential scientific and technical staff, as well as others. Once the briefing wrapped up, all materials were returned over to the CIA, and according to Callahan, one of the CIA staff stated, "This event never happened. We were never here. We are confiscating all the data, and you are sworn to secrecy." While Callahan turned over the data as requested, he retained materials not explicitly included in the request. He would later share this data and his story with the world at the National Press Club Conference on UFOs in Washington, D.C., 2007. In the years since the flight of JAL 1628, skeptics, debunkers, and true believers would continue to offer explanations, contradictions, new informations, or conspiracy theories about the evening in 1986. But as often happens with UFO cases, we are still left with the question of what happened, of what Captain Terauchi and his crew saw in the skies that night.
So that's the rundown of the incident as it happened. Now, some of the stuff that Jimmy mentioned at the end, that's according only to John Callahan, that FAA investigator. When did the story come out? When did it really start hitting the press? Was it in December? It was about a month after this, right?
Right. It was in December when the Japanese news agency released it. It was probably just a couple of days after that it was picked up internationally.
Yeah, so a few weeks had went by, and the FAA had forgotten about the incident because everyone landed safely, and they went on to whatever else was going on. The FAA chief in Anchorage called Callahan and said, "Hey, what do you want me to tell the press?" Callahan says, "Just tell them we're going to investigate it," and that was it. And after 3 months, on March 5th, 1987, Paul Strzok, who was the Anchorage FAA representative, retracted some of the earlier suggestions that the controllers had confirmed a UFO. They ascribed the incident to a split radar image, just to give a little clarification. And we spoke about this a little bit before. Air traffic controllers track aircraft by what's known as a transponder. All airplanes have a transponder on them. I don't care if it's a civilian or a military aircraft or general aviation. That transponder will transmit all of the information to air traffic controllers. And that way, at a glance on their scopes, they can see what that airplane is. They can know where it's going. Because if you're going to fly anywhere, whether you are an individual or you're a commercial airliner, you have to file a flight plan. So once you file your flight plan and you have this transponder, the air traffic controller can look at that data on that transponder and know everything they need to know. They can know whether you're a Cessna or if you're a Boeing 747. They can also tell if you're a military aircraft. The FAA controls all of the airspace over the United States, and that includes the military, and they can ask to review any data that they want. Now, one thing that came out about this, and it screams government cover-up, of course, is that whenever the investigators wanted the military tapes, because all this stuff, especially in 1986, all of this information is being recorded, every bit of it. I mean, they can reenact the entire incident as if they're sitting in the control room. All the voices are recorded, all of the data on the scopes are recorded. So it's as if you are live sitting there watching this happen now. They can recreate it at any moment they want. And the FAA can go to the military and request their tapes as well. Now, what they commonly did then, and I'm sure it's digital now, but back then what they commonly did, they would retain these tapes for, I'm wanting to say at least 15 days, but maybe a little bit longer. Then they would just record over them. Whenever John Callahan contacts the Anchorage ATC, the military installation, they said, "Oh, we're running short of tape. We've already recorded over it." And it had only been 12 days. So that makes the whole incident seem a little suspicious at the very beginning, beyond any of the other stuff that John Callahan says. So the military wasn't able to provide their radar data, and then later on said they never saw anything.
So just to add to the radar data thing, so we basically have a primary radar return. That's the one.
All right. I kind of went off the track there when I started talking about the FAA.
Well, this is
go ahead with the split radar image.
Yeah, so
Go for it.
we have a primary radar return, which is a system where a ground-based antenna transmits a radar pulse and then listens for a small amount of return energy that is reflected from an aircraft. The time delay between the transmission pulse and the receipt of the reflected return is a measure of the range. So that way they get a distance of where that object is in the air. They don't know how high it is. They just know how far away from the radar it is. The secondary radar return requires an airborne transponder which responds to the receipt of a pulse from a ground-based antenna by transmitting a return signal. And because the transponder transmits a much stronger signal than that which is reflected off of the aircraft from the primary radar system, greater range and reliability can be achieved. And the second radar return and cheaper and more efficient ground equipment can be used. Additionally, information such as altitude and a code can be added to the return signal, like Steve was saying, that gives you more information about that specific aircraft in terms of what size it is, how heavy it is, and then they'll have the flight plan that they can look up based off of that transponder signal if they need additional information about it. Now we have the split radar return. Now this is really interesting, and Bruce Maccabee, who is a PhD scientist and often is utilized by UFO groups like MUFON to analyze data, is a legit scientist. He's done a lot of stuff for the Navy. He's written a lot of technical papers. He's written up a very thorough and detailed analysis of this particular case, and it's really interesting. We'll have it on our website for this episode. If you want to know more information, it's a great resource to go look at and review details about this case. The split radar section is really interesting, and I just want to read a couple of parts of this part of his report. We'll start with split radar. The event was unconfirmed because a second radar target near the JAL flight at the time of the reported sighting was not another aircraft, but rather a split radar return from JAL Boeing 747. That's a quote. In other words, the FAA couldn't confirm the sighting on radar because the traffic or primary return reported by the air traffic control tower in Anchorage at the time of the sighting was merely an artifact of the radar set. Recall that the transponder return or blip is separate from the primary return or blip like we were just talking about. These two should be immediately adjacent or one on top of the other under ordinary conditions. What the FAA was saying was that because of a minor and temporary malfunction of the radar, the primary return was separated in position on the radar screen from the transponder return, thus making it look as if there were two separate radar-reflective objects in the sky. The press release did not mention that the split return effect was contradicted by the fact that the extra echo did not come back with every sweep of the radar, and by a statement by the air traffic controller who said that they rarely, if ever, get a split image in the area where the JAL jet was flying. The press release did not offer an explanation for the visual sighting, nor did it dispute the crew's claim that something unusual was seen. The press release ignored the visual sighting. That's from Maccabee's work. It's interesting that the split radar, at least from Bruce Maccabee's vantage point, doesn't hold up.
So we have the FAA official explanation, which just talks about the split radar image, the split radar screen where it's a shadow. The transponder and the radar return do not match up, which is causing this kind of shadow image slightly behind the airliner. That's their explanation for it. But what about the visual sighting? And they make no mention. The FAA totally disregards in their press release the fact that the pilot and the co-pilot and the radio operator all saw something else.
Initially, Philip Klass, widely known as a debunker for the UFO subject matter, he assigns the sightings to Jupiter and Mars and did not wait for the full release of the FAA package because very quickly it was clear that based on the direction of the aircraft, the time of day, etc., that there was absolutely no way that it was Jupiter or Mars as possible causes of the sighting.
Maybe there is some type of mundane explanation for this, but at the same time, we once again have an oversimplified explanation for a very experienced pilot and crew. How many hours did Captain Tarucci have?
He had over 10,000 hours.
10,000 hours. What's the chances that he's going to suddenly see Mars for the first time and say, I think it's a UFO? that just doesn't hold water. It's just oversimplification. I've seen so many of those with the skeptics and the debunkers. Not really the skeptics, but the debunkers just saying Jupiter and Mars. Oh, well, it was really bright. And I know they'll work it out with the way the turn does and all this kind of stuff. And they just look for whatever bright astronomical object would be in the sky at that particular time and say that's what it is. But I just think that a pilot with that many hours, I don't agree with that. Like I said, maybe there is some type of mundane explanation, but I don't think that's it.
PsyCop was not done with this case. After the initial release of the report by the FAA, and it was clear that Jupiter and Mars could not be an explanation for it, according to Class, his second attempt at explaining this sighting was turbulent ice crystals could have generated flame-colored lights, and this would explain why the lights would periodically and suddenly disappear and then reappear as cloud conditions ahead changed. So it's lights reflecting off of ice crystals, I guess, in the skies.
And it was so bright that it lit up the cockpit.
Well, you know.
Also, I guess it's worth pointing out, Captain Tarucci had reported UFOs on 2 other occasions. For the skeptics and the debunkers, that really raised a red flag, saying, well, he's a repeat offender.
A repeat reporter, but he...
Well, in their opinion, a repeat offender.
Yeah, right. So was it 2 times? I had read it was 5.
Good question. We need clarification on that.
Regardless, the captain is a little odd. First of all, in his sworn statement, both initially after the incident, as they landed in Anchorage, they were interviewed, all 3 crew members. My understanding is that both the captain and first officer responded to the interview questions in English, but their English was not perfect, their first language being Japanese. The second officer, first engineer, Yoshio, requested a translator to translate what he was saying. There was a translator in the room. Apparently, Captain Terauchi was the only one that claimed to have felt heat on his face from the UFOs. And he was the only one to claim to see the larger UFO. The other 2 crew members did not see the same thing, or at least did not report that they saw the same thing. The captain even took the leap to say that he saw 2 spaceships. He referred to them as spaceships, and he referred to the large craft that he claimed to have seen as the mothership. And he had done this on previous occasions. You have to look at the captain and wonder whether or not he'd been drinking some of that Beaujolais wine before he took the captain's chair.
I've got a little clarification. He had reported 2 other UFO sightings prior to the November 17th sighting. 2 more afterwards. So after this sighting. In all, I guess, during his career, he had reported 5. The other members of the crew did say they saw lights.
Yes, they absolutely did.
Captain Tarucci probably embellished the sighting a bit more than the others did. And they maybe wanted to play it down. I was listening to another podcast earlier today, and I don't remember which one it was, but he had recordings of all these different airline pilots, and they said, do you wish to report a UFO? And every single one was, we do not wish to report a UFO at this time. No, we don't want to report a UFO. It was all these different incidents where you could hear these pilots just, and I don't blame them, because what happened to Captain Terauchi, the Japanese Airlines said, you're embarrassing the country after this broke in the United States, became a big story, and they let him fly a desk for quite a while after this incident. They grounded him for a while.
For years.
He finally got back in a plane and was able to retire. Nothing good came of it for him. So we have that. We have the sighting. What I think is important about this particular incident, and one reason I wanted to bring it up, as Jimmy mentioned earlier, and we've mentioned the name, is a John Callahan. Now, John Callahan was a division chief of accidents and investigations in Washington, D.C. He was pretty high up in the chain of command. He said there was only 2 or 3 people between him and the admiral, which is what they call the head of the FAA. The incident began for him when he got a call from the FAA chief in Alaska about a week after this incident, wanting to know what to tell the media about the UFO. And he said not to tell them anything, just let them know we're going to do an investigation. So he had the control tower in Alaska send him everything. The FAA, they have rules and regulations. They know what they're doing. They send all the tapes, and again, it records everything. It records all the conversation. It records the conversation in the room. It records what's going on in the cockpit as far as them translating transmitting. So they send all this information, and with those tapes in Washington, D.C., they're able to set up a scope and run the tapes through it, and they're able to watch it and hear it exactly as it happened. They do this all the time, especially in plane crashes, when they recover black boxes, and they take the tower data, all the radar data, and they're able to recreate it so they can see exactly what happened, in particular if there's an accident involving air traffic control. So then he calls the military and asks for their tapes, and he gets a call the next day. They said that their tapes were already back in service, and it had only been 12 days, and he said that they are supposed to keep them longer than 12 days. The military claimed they were running short on tape, so they put theirs back in service. In other words, they put them back in service just to record over them and reuse them. So after they set the scope up and did the investigation, John Callahan made a videotape of it with all the recording of all the people. He made a video of what it looked like and everything that happened. And he took that to the vice admiral. He was just going to look at it for about 5 minutes, but then he ended up watching the entire videotape and had all of his meetings canceled. And he told Mr. Callahan not to say anything else about this incident until he heard back from him. A big meeting was set up. Now, again, this is all according to John Callahan.
The next day, right? Set up the
next day.
The very next day in what they call the round room, which I guess is where they do all of their big FAA meetings.
Well, he said someone booked the room, and that he said if you could ever find that record to find out who booked the room, because the CIA, whatever, of course, they'd probably use a false name anyway, so...
John Smith booked the room.
Joe's Barbecue Shop or something.
Joe's Barbecue booked a room for the CIA.
But one thing that he said that was really important, he could hear in a telephone conversation with the military controller while they were in the control room with their very own control room, verifying all of the visual sightings that the pilot was seeing. And so he said, it's now at your 1 o'clock. And then the pilot would say, yeah, it's on my 1 o'clock. When they did those 2 360-degree turns, it changed its position. It was always trailing or within about 8 miles.
So I only saw that there was a single 360-degree turn in Bruce McAbee's reporting. So was there 2 or was there 3?
I thought there was 2, and I'm basing that on looking at some charts, but I may have misinterpreted the charts.
So the way I understand it, there was 2 corrections, 2 flight adjustments that was...
But only one 360.
Done, but only one 360, right. He did an altitude change down 3,000 feet, and then he did a course correction to 240 degrees before they actually did that 360-degree turn. The intent of that was to be able to do a turn and see if they could see what was following them, the assumption being that whatever was following them would be visible as they were doing that turn.
Right. He did a 45-degree turn and descended from 35,000 feet to 31,000 feet, and then did a 360-degree turn later. Now, it said the short-range radar at Fairbanks failed to register the object, but I do know that on those tapes that he showed, there you can see a shadow. I watched a interview with him, and he goes over it. He's got those videos.
Who has the videos?
John Callahan.
From which air traffic controller?
From the
Fairbanks?
Traffic controller from Fairbanks.
Oh.
And he shows a little shadow behind it. He says that's the unknown right there.
On the radar display, huh?
Now, another thing, too, but I don't understand that, because at one point he said that if that object was that big, he said the filters wouldn't pick it up. It would pick it up as weather.
Correct.
He also said that there is a radar in the nose of the 747. Then that's how they first started seeing objects was through their radar. And that's when they asked if there was traffic. Yeah. I think even before they saw the lights.
Right. So this is an interesting piece of the story, right? So the 747 has radar built into the nose of their plane that is specifically geared towards identifying weather. Now, the captain claimed to have seen a green blob. The first engineer, second officer, first engineer who was in the back seat, he said that it was more of like a streak. Now, a green streak rather than a green blob. Now, a green streak on that radar indicates light clouds. It's very possible what the radar on the plane was picking up was light clouds ahead at about 14 to 20 kilometers.
One thing that John Callahan pointed out was that the military radars are much more sophisticated. He said they have short-range radar, long-range radar. They're able to pick up much more detail, and rightly so, because they're looking for threats to the United States, military threats.
Particularly given that we're talking about Alaska, and it's a stone's throw away from Russia. We're talking about Cold War era airspace. They are taking no chances.
If ICBMs would be launched from the Soviet Union in those days to the United States, the shortest way is over the North Pole. That's where we always looked for the threat to be. Alaska played a huge part in that. Alaska played a huge part in all the B-52s loaded with nuclear weapons that were right outside of Soviet airspace, ready to go in. And
so it was those Alaska guys that were letting us know that we need to do our turtle ducking under our desk and
duck and cover.
Duck and cover.
So in this meeting, as Jimmy, I believe, had mentioned earlier, he said that there was 3 people from the CIA, 3 people from the FBI, 3 people from President Ronald Reagan's scientific team, and there were some others that he didn't quite know. They had a lot of technical questions, what type of antenna they had, and that sort of thing. Wanted to know all the details of what the radar was like. There were a lot of technicians there. They told him to gather up all their data and to bring it to that room. He said there were boxes of printouts, and he had made a videotape, but he had made a copy of the videotape of the reconstruction of the scope of what they saw and the reconstruction of the tapes and the audio and all that kind of stuff. I want to point out that he said you can clearly hear the military radar operator confirming with them everything that JAL 1628 was seeing. Again, this is all according to John Callahan, but it sounded pretty legitimate to me. Once the meeting was over, he said he was behind all of the officials, and all the other people were out front. They made them swear to secrecy, but they never asked him to. After it was over, they said, none of this ever happened. This meeting never happened. We're taking all this stuff. John Callahan said, they didn't ask me to swear, so I didn't.
Also in attendance at that meeting was Ron Pandolfini and Bruce Maccabee. Now, Ron Pandolfini is what a lot of people consider the Mulder, the Fox Mulder of the CIA. Some people who think that maybe Ron is a disinformation specialist for the CIA, and others believe that he's a legit source from within the CIA on UFO matters. Regardless, both Ron and Bruce Maccabee at that same meeting do not remember any statement being made by the CIA requiring people to swear themselves to secrecy about the meeting never happening or that any of the data. As a matter of fact, by that time, most of this data was out into the public already. So it almost seems unusual that they would require everyone to be sworn to secrecy. Additionally, they gave all of that material to Bruce Maccabee to write a full report, which he did, which we'll supply to you on our website, a link to it. He had all that material and published a full report in 1987 that goes step by step through every single aspect of this case. And it's very detailed, pretty compelling, very thorough, and it goes through the problems with both the skeptics in terms of how they view this incident, as well as the 3 crew members in the cabin, the air traffic control tower people both at Anchorage and at Elmendorf, and then talks a little bit about all of the specific technical issues that line up and those that don't. So I'm not sure I believe John Callahan. You have this discrepancy between what Bruce and Ron are saying and what John Callahan is saying. This was all reported to Leslie Kean, who wrote a paper on this, or wrote a book rather on this, and included John Callahan stuff, but was made aware of this discrepancy and decided not to include it in her book. Basically ignore it. And I'm really curious why she chose to do that, because she's a reporter, presumably a very legitimate reporter. She's the one that broke the 2017 New York Times article on the Tic Tac UFO. So that's just one aside that we need to bring to light.
Okay. I would say that perhaps the data that they received was only part of the data. I don't know that because John Callahan in the interview I saw wasn't asked a question like that, so I don't know. I'm just going over what I saw during this interview. According to him, everyone in the room was sworn to secrecy. The CIA confiscated all of the information, and he went to one of the CIA officers and said, Why can't we tell the American people? They should know that this sort of thing's going on. And they said, we can't tell the American people about this because there'd be a big panic that if they knew that UFOs were real. He said that he was kind of unsure of what the object was. He didn't really know. But then the way they talked in that meeting, they were very excited to get their hands on this data because it was, he said that those people in that meeting said this was the first time they had 30 minutes worth of radar data on a UFO, according to him. He said they had a ton of data that they could review. And he said that's what sealed it for him, that he knew it was something very unusual, because he said he didn't really know what it was until the way they reacted at this meeting. Where his information came from now, the information he has is that he had the original videotape that he made on that scope reconstruction. In other words, everything that was said and done, everything the controller saw, he had a videotape and he still has it. He had the audio recording of the cockpit and the communication between the cockpit and the tower. And he has all of these charts that map exactly where the airplane was and where the unknown was at all times. He has like very, very detailed information. All of that stuff was in his office. And he thought that they were going to come and ask for that, but he said they didn't ask for any of that stuff. They just took what was in the room. And so when he retired, I guess someone cleaned out his office and they sent him all that stuff. In the FAA, I guess they just sent it to him. So he said he kept it. And he thought about it for a while. He said, but who do I tell? As soon as you say something about a UFO, everybody thinks you've got a screw loose. Like, hey, when I was in the FAA, I investigated a UFO. The CIA was there, but they made everybody keep quiet. He believes that there was really something there, and it's just a case of government cover-up. My speculation about this whole thing is just that it all goes back to the Robertson panel. If that is true, if everything he's saying about that meeting just tells me that even in 1986, 30 years after the Robertson panel, more than 30 years after the Robertson panel, that the CIA or the FBI are still in the business of, if there is some type of UFO, some type of unusual, extraordinary sighting, especially ones that have professionals involved, like airline pilots, and you have data and all this, that they want to keep it under wraps. They want to keep it quiet. So I don't know. I don't know about what you have found, but I'll tell you what I will do. I'm going to send you the interview. It's on YouTube. John Callahan. It lasts about 20 minutes, between 20 and 25 minutes. We will post that on our webpage, and at least post a link to it on our webpage. It'll be in the show notes of this episode. You can watch the John Callahan interview for yourself, listeners, and you can decide what you think about what he's saying. I think he sounds pretty legitimate. He was part of the press club event that Dr. Stephen Greer put together. In fact, this video is put on YouTube by Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project. I think he calls it something different now. And I don't agree with everything that Dr. Stephen Greer believes. I mean, some of his ideas I'm a little skeptical about. Let's just put it that way.
I'm even more skeptical about.
This sounds like a legitimate sighting to me of something unusual, something extraordinary. Maybe the split radar is the answer. Maybe that's what it was. But if John Callahan is to be believed, the military was also picking up this object, and were able to confirm where it was around the airliner at any given time. And then their tapes disappear because they have a much more sophisticated radar system.
Yeah, so I look at this as actually two different sightings, and I treat them separately. So the first sighting, both the captain and first officer, and even the second officer, claimed to have seen what appeared to be some kind of craft ahead of them. So that seems like there's more legitimacy towards that first sighting. And the first sighting was what they perceived to be two separate crafts, because initially they were one on top of the other. As they came up from 2,000 feet above them, it looked like they were one above the other. And then eventually they went side by side. So it seemed to them that it was two separate crafts, and while they could not make out the form of the crafts, they could see the lights. And it wasn't lights reflected from inside the cockpit, because they turned the cockpit's lights off. All you had was the sensors, the lights from the sensors, which isn't very bright. All three of them are pretty sure for that first sighting that you have two craft that eventually veer off and go away. Now, it's entirely possible that was two military crafts, because there are always military craft that we are testing and that we're flying and we're utilizing that the world doesn't know about. So it's entirely possible, but that maybe that was two military craft.
That's something that John Callahan said that he thought at first. I don't think he says it in this interview, but it was something I saw written somewhere else, that he thought that it was perhaps an early test of the B-2 bomber. But I will say they should have informed the FAA what it was.
Maybe they don't. Who knows, right?
I don't know. I mean, I'm led to believe that the FAA controls all the airspace. And if they were having this investigation, well, they may have told the admiral and not even... It just seems like they would have told the chief investigator, hey, we were testing some top secret aircraft, but we can't talk about it. I'm sure they would have accepted that.
I just don't know what to...
I mean, I don't know.
Believe with how government operates. I mean, David Fravor even mentioned that he used to take planes, and I think I mentioned this before, where they would just drift planes in and then go vertical and shoot off their engines. So it looked like, they're afterburners. Yeah. So it looks like a UFO flying up above campsites in the desert. So there's some mischievousness to our pilots in the military from time to time. Part of their personality, I suspect. So that's the first sighting. That seems very reasonable to me, that you can look at that and say that that's likely, or could be, as a possible explanation, military craft. But then you have this second sighting that neither the first officer nor the second officer will articulate that they agree with. And you just have this captain who's reported 2 times before and 2 times afterwards that he sees motherships, and that's his words, and spaceships. So he immediately makes that leap, and he sees something outside that he doesn't quite understand, and he says that it's a mothership, or it's this large thing. The other 2 crew members don't necessarily back up his story on that part. The previous part, they do. That part, not entirely. But then again, we still have the radar data, right? And the unlikelihood that it is actually a split return, because you don't have it on every sweep. I mean, you'd have to have it on every sweep, and a split return would normally not occur on every sweep.
And then there's also the fact that they sent a United Airlines flight to also see if they could see the object.
United Airlines Flight 93, if I remember correctly.
United, if the object was there, would have been flying above it. I think they came in at 29,000 feet. The transcript shows 29,000 feet. Saying the United Airline aircraft JAL 1628 was at 31,000 feet. The aircraft should maintain 33. Actual transcript shows it at 29, so they would have actually flew under it.
And it was backlit, so you could clearly see everything around it.
Yeah, they said they flashed their navigation lights or their landing lights at each other to confirm visually where each one was, and they both did say they saw it, but according to Captain Terauchi, that
he's a samurai.
That the UFO disappeared whenever the United flight came close by. But now Callahan says that the United that went on to see what was there, that the UFO followed that plane until it made its final approach.
That's what Terauchi said?
No, that's what Callahan says. Callahan's interview on that is pretty convincing, and I've seen him on the press club, and I've seen him mentioned in a couple other documentaries, but this is a really good, long interview, and he goes through the whole story, shows little bits of the video itself. I'm not sure where you can go, but they claim all of the information is on Stephen Greer's organization's website. I went on there and looked around some, but I didn't spend a lot of time looking at that. I just kind of went by the interview because I mostly just wanted to find the testimony of John Callahan, because he's the one that has brought more light to this case as far as it being a real UFO or a real flying saucer than anyone else.
Yeah, so where do you end up at the end of the day? What do you think?
What I think is, it's one of those things. I find the case, and you're not going to get me to give you some kind of like 43% and 57.
27.68%.
No, I mean, I think pure speculation part. I think John Callahan, who was a professional, and what does he have to gain by coming forward and saying, I think it was a UFO, and I think our government's covering it up, and I think the people should know about it. I think he really had little to gain. There's probably been a lot of crackpots and a lot of mainstream media, but just a lot of attention. I mean, if you had some information like that, you would have to really think hard about going public and then being on these documentaries and telling your story and then hearing all the skeptics and everyone call you a liar and dealing with all that. This man retired from the FAA. He was a chief investigator in Washington, D.C. I think he had very, very little to gain. He believes that is what that situation was, that it was an unknown, perhaps an extraterrestrial craft, in his words, and that the government's covering it up. And I find that intriguing. And the information you brought up that Bruce Maccabee has, I've seen him interviewed, and he's pretty open-minded about the possibility of UFOs, flying saucers. I would trust what he has to say. We should probably try to follow up and confirm that Bruce was given the same documentation that John Callahan says he has.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's got tons of stuff. Have you ever seen that interview on the Press Club?
I did.
Yeah, it was on, I think it's on I Know What I Saw, the movie by James Fox, but it's part 2. And that's all about the meeting at the Press Club. There's several professional soldiers, and John Callahan's on there, and it's a pretty long interview. I didn't watch that one this go around. I found the interview with him on YouTube. He goes into a lot of detail with it, and he tells his story, and it sounds like a pretty good story. Is it possible he's wrong? He is interpreting this in the wrong way? I think it's possible. I mean, but he was there, and he said that the government, the CIA, Reagan's scientific people were there, the FBI. He claims they were very excited about this and excited to get their hands on that data.
To be clear, Bruce doesn't come out of the analysis with the idea of it's a legitimate UFO sighting or not. He comes out of it pretty neutral. As a matter of fact, he's the one who says essentially that the split radar explanation for the second primary return doesn't make any sense to him. In order for it to make sense, you would have to have that split return occurring on every sweep, and it wasn't the case.
I saw that somewhere else too, where they said that it would be very unusual for it to go on for 30 minutes, for one thing.
Exactly.
And then, of course, if we're to believe what John Callahan says about the military being on the phone and being able to see the target the entire time that it's around the airliner, then who knows? I mean, it must have been something.
Do you think maybe some B-2 bomber pilots were getting drunk and up there flying and like they're following behind going, woohoo, we're UFOs, baby. Stay close to him. Oh, he's turning 360. Let's follow him.
2 issues I would have with that. Actually, 3. One is that I doubt that a B-2 bomber in 1986, which was top secret, I'm not sure. I can't remember exactly when the B-2 bomber was revealed. I don't think they would have been playing around in the airspace around a commercial airliner. I find that highly unlikely. The second thing is it is a stealth bomber. I'm not so sure it would have been picked up on the military radar.
That's true. But let me throw this out to you. I saw Top Gun, and those guys don't seem very, very sensible or reasonable to me. And I can see
bomber pilots. You've got bomber pilots, and then you got fighter pilots. Yeah.
Oh, are bomber pilots any different?
Bomber pilots are trained to stay on target, no matter what. You got to stay on target.
They don't play volleyball on the beach. They don't do the Top Gun stuff. They don't fly in the danger zone.
I think being a bomber pilot's kind of like being a bass player in a band.
Oh, that's lonely.
And then you got the guitar players, more or less like the
sad.
fighter pilot.
I feel bad for bomber pilots now.
Yeah, especially since you're a bass player, right?
Exactly. I know exactly your pain, bomber pilots. You're the bass players. You're the bass players of the air wing. Poor bastards.
So they're the ones that's got to keep it together. They're the ones that have to stay on target and deliver the payload.
That's right.
The fighter pilots are all over the place.
They're the
just
anchor.
do whatever they feel.
They're the anchor. They are the source of all of the magic in the world. Bass players and bomber pilots.
That's right. We've uncovered that at least in this podcast tonight. Well, where do you come in on this?
So,
what do you think?
When I first started researching it, I was like, this is another one of those easily debunked kind of things, mainly because the captain was such a loon. Now, I hate to say that, but come on. You see a mothership like 5 times, and you're not, and you're transporting Beaujolais wine. Very suspect. Very suspect. But there's a lot of other data here that you have to take into account. You can't just nitpick and pull out 1 or 2 pieces of information to fit a narrative. This is another one of those cases where I still think there's probably a very mundane explanation for it, because I don't like the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So I go jaded into every one of these things, just so people know, and I can be completely honest. But with this particular case, if I'm open-minded about UFOs, I would put this still on the pile of ones where there's no conclusive evidence to completely rule out an extraterrestrial hypothesis. I would just put it I put it on the fringe still, but still keep it within. This is very interesting. I'd like to know more.
Very good. I mean, I'm somewhat there myself. I mean, like I said, first of all, I've never ever said that I think UFOs or flying saucers or extraterrestrial. I just don't know what they are. But I think there's something unusual, and it's a mystery in the world.
Yeah, you know what would make me really sad is if that UFOs are real, but they're inhabited by a bunch of different ALFs. If anybody remembers ALF from the 80s.
I wish I couldn't remember that.
That was horrible. It would make me so sad.
I never watched it ever. Yeah.
It's
not even one episode.
Well, that's because it has this horrible Muppet in there with no sense of humor.
Yeah.
For those people who like Alf, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you like Alf.
You managed to insult at least one group of people every episode. I have noticed that about you.
Well,
you either insult people. You're insulting shows and.
Well, to be fair, the only people that like Alf are from Detroit.
Come on, man. We might have listeners in Detroit.
I love Detroit. Detroit Rock City, baby.
Wait a minute. This is like a rerun. Somebody will think, I've already listened to this episode. Again, most of my opinion is based on the statements made by John Callahan. It's where I spend a lot of my time looking at this because I knew you were going to do the rundown on sort of the skeptic side of things. At least based on that, I find it to be a very intriguing case. But again, on the government cover-up part, we did the history of UFOs declassified to talk about the history of UFOs and why we are where we are now. We did part 1 and 2. And in part 2, we discussed the Robertson panel. And that was whenever the CIA put together a scientific panel to look at UFOs and to decide what we should do about them, or collectively as the government. And what they said was the public is getting hysterical. We need to tamp it down. And really beginning in late 1952, early 1953 is when this whole program within our government of denial, demystifying UFOs, and just always coming up with some type of mundane explanation for UFOs and never ever admitting that there's something they can't explain, is why we are where we are in the United States today. And I'm not sure how it is in Europe. I know we have some European listeners from Germany, from England, from France. I would be curious to know in your home country, how would something like that be handled? How are UFOs looked at? Do they have the same stigma that they do in the United States? I'd be very curious to know. If you have a second, drop us a line. firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. Be glad to hear from you.
I have 2 things to say. Bruce Maccabee, I just want to get this out there so that for all future ones, I can plant my flag on this particular issue. In response to Philip Klass's explanation on this particular thing, he states, and I agree with this completely, so you know where I stand now. Klass's explanation verges on scientific garbage. Full stop. So I just want to say that Philip Klass, you are not a scientist. In no way do you represent the scientific community. You are what we call a tool. So if he comes up again in any future things, I'm going to immediately place him in Detroit. I'm just saying.
Come on, man.
No, I like
Lay off of Detroit.
I like Detroit Rock City. Detroit Rock City rules, man. I wouldn't put Philip Glass in Detroit because Detroit doesn't deserve something that awful.
Yeah, well, Philip Glass passed away a number of years ago. So
yeah, well, I'm not hurting his feelings then. So,
that's true.
Right. So that was the first thing. The second thing, well, I was drinking, so I forgot what the second thing was. What were we talking about? Yeah, I know for a fact that Italy is way cool with UFOs, very comfortable with the topic, ready to share, and I think it has to do with wine. And, love you guys in France. You fantastic wine. But me personally, it's just personal taste. My favorite wine is Sangiovese wine from Italy. Love it.
What do you like that is in France?
Well, I like a lot of Bordeaux's. I mean...
Well, there you go.
The French wines are amazing. Like...
We have listeners in France, so
well, I've got to say that if I'm going to drink a Pinot Noir, it's going to be from France. If I'm going to drink a Cab, it's going to be from France. If I'm going to drink a Cab Blend, it's going to be from France.
Did you say you drink a cat?
Cabernet.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Well, see, I'm not a wine guy. I don't know.
Yeah. But if I'm going to drink something from,
would you take a cab to a Bigfoot hunt?
Oh hell yeah! That's what you take to a Bigfoot hunt. You don't take a Sangiovese. You take a Cab.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, if you got anything else that we want to talk about on this.
No, I think we've covered most of it. I'm really interested to see what our listeners have to say about this and if they have any insights or maybe something we missed or didn't cover. We didn't go over the Travis Walton correction, so I just want to put that out there really quick. So on our Travis Walton episode, we got some information from one of our listeners who pointed us to a report that details the part that we were talking about in terms of how radiation affects tree growth. That information came from the Travis Walton Story documentary I think it's around 32 minutes into the documentary, 32 to 36. They have a section in there where they reference a Poland study about how tree growth is affected by radiation specific to Chernobyl. This later study seems to contradict that earlier study, assuming that they had read it correctly. The people in the documentary read that original study and understood it correctly. Now, we're going to try to get that original study. It costs money. It's like $35. It's really cheap, but we can't post that because it's a research paper and requires purchasing the paper in order to have it and read it. I don't think it's legit that we can just post it for you, but we will put a link to it so you can go and download it yourself if you're that interested. And I'll go ahead and download it and read through it and give you guys my take on it and how much it lines up with that later paper.
There's another study that I ran across because once the listener pointed that out, I became very curious about it. And Jimmy's absolutely right. I mean, he made that comment because it's in that documentary. So that may not be the best place to get your scientific information is out of a UFO documentary. That is lesson learned. We're still kind of new here. But I did find one that sampled 105 spruce conifer trees, a pine tree, near Chernobyl. And the evidence that they have is that radiation's not good for trees.
Or really anything, unless it's transmitted through a spider.
Yeah, and then you're bitten and you become Spider-Man. But that's rare. It's only happened once that we know of.
Pretty rare.
Well, unless you make Marvel movies, and then it happens like every 5 years.
That's right.
But anyway, it was really neat. I do want to post that study. I was talking to Jimmy about that earlier. They cut some of those trees out of that forest, and you can see the evidence of the radiation before and after. The wood looks all healthy and white and everything. And then it looks like a really dark brown and these little tiny rings that after the Chernobyl accident, all these years later, has still shown that the vegetation around Chernobyl has not been healthy. It seems to completely contradict that it accelerated growth. This other study, which looked very thorough.
Yeah, and I suspect once we read through that original study, we'll find that it's either been misinterpreted or misquoted.
One thing they did find in the study that I found, there was a lot of variation, and there was more variation than what you would normally expect to see in a healthy spruce. That may be the misinterpretation of just looking at the variation, but overall, the tree growth has been stunted, and it's negatively affect the vegetation around Chernobyl. we're just throwing that out there. That's a correction. We want to put the correct information in front of you, so we apologize for that, and we'll think twice about pulling our information from a UFO documentary, unless we make it clear that it's from a UFO documentary.
But I'm okay with stating information like that, just so long as we follow up with it. And, you guys out there listening, feel free to let us know when we get something wrong. We want to get the right information out there, get it correct. Right. And we're okay with that. And also, I think you said you followed up with some additional information that supported that impact on vegetation, not just at Chernobyl, but also at the Fukushima plants.
That's right.
In Japan after the tsunami.
Yeah, I looked that one up as well. They were the fir trees, Japanese firs, which is another conifer. Those trees are not developing shoots as they should be, as normal fir trees would. On March 11th, 2011, there was an earthquake off the coast of Japan that resulted in a huge tsunami that ended up flooding and causing significant damage to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. That caused the release of radiation. And so what has been found now, 10 years later, is that the radiation is still affecting the vegetation there as well, that the Japanese firs are not developing shoots the way they should. They're not branching out the way they should compared to a healthy one. So from what we've found, I don't see any case of where radiation would be a positive effect on any kind of natural growth in any kind of trees. In our report on Travis Walton, we said similar to Chernobyl, but I did find a report that said cosmic radiation can have a positive effect on vegetation, on trees.
Cosmic, you say?
And we are cosmic sponge, so I'm thinking, is there a connection
Are
here?
we responsible for Travis Walton's tree growth issue?
It could be.
We won't say. It's
read the book. And if you get that joke, then you're older than I am, or at least my age.
The book coming soon.
Now, remember that? There was some like Mysterious Worlds book series. What was it they always did, the book series? Time Life books.
Oh, yeah,
remember they used
yeah.
to advertise them on TV? There was something about like mysterious places, and they would be like, did you know Stonehenge was built in 10,000 BC or something like that? And they'd go, really? Read the book. And you don't remember those commercials?
Yeah, I remember those commercials. Man, I grew up with a set of encyclopedias from 1926.
Hey, I bought some of those. I got them back there, man.
I was wondering where they went.
Once again, there's everything in my bookcase. I have to go get some of my Time Life. I can't remember what the title of there was two different series.
Yeah,
I bought it. I bought a couple.
If I was in school and I was writing anything that happened after 1926, I was screwed. That's
why 1926?
Because that's where my encyclopedia set ended.
Oh, that's so funny. I had two different encyclopedia sets growing up, and one of them was from the 1950s. Now the other one was modern. My parents bought at some point, but we would go back and read those old ones, and they were pretty cool. Yeah. Is there anything else we have on this case, on JAL 1628 listeners? If there is something we missed, something you disagree with, you have some good information you would like us to share with everyone, be sure, don't be shy. Just email the show and let us know what it is. Also, while we're on that subject, if you have a story to tell, some type of extraordinary encounter, give us an email, send it and let us know. We'd love to share that with our other listeners on the show if you want us to. And also, if you want to remain anonymous, be sure and let us know that.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. All I got to say is that's it. I'm done.
I was hoping you might say something about, to carry it on and say, check out our social media, check out our Instagram account. Jimmy's been working pretty hard on some funny Instagrams, so you might like those. And check out our Facebook page. We've been posting a lot of the news reports that we have here on the show, but there's a lot more on there. If you want to read about the giant aliens with the little knobs for heads, the full story's on our page. Jimmy seems to like that story. I can tell he's going to log in and check it out as soon as we get off here.
Best story ever. Knobby-headed alien.
And the last thing I would say is please rate and review the show. If you like what you hear, and again, we have just been thrilled by the number of downloads we've gotten. We're growing pretty fast, a lot faster than we thought we would. Thank you, everyone that's been listening. We really appreciate it. We love to see the downloads, and we love to see the people we know that have subscribed. So thanks a lot. If you're listening, especially if you're listening on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, go in and give us a good rating if you like what you hear. That helps bump us up in the ratings and helps other people find the show. And there's a lot of UFO podcasts, so we got a long way to go before we get up to the page 1. However, we did make the top 20 under science and astronomy on Apple Podcasts pretty quickly. We got there after the third or fourth episode, I think.
Yeah, had to cut a few break lines, but we got there.
Yeah.
Next week on Cosmic Sponge, be prepared to enter the deep, dark forest of the American Northwest.
Every week when we come on, we say Cosmic Sponge, where we talk about UFOs and other weird wonders of the world. Well, next week, we've decided to do one of those weird wonders of the world. And Jimmy, can you tell me what we're going to be talking about next week?
Next week, we're going to be talking about the terrifying, large-footed great ape creature thing that lurks in the back of your mind when you're out in the woods. Whether you be in Arkansas or West Virginia or Oregon, California, or San Antonio, Texas, Bigfoot lurks just around the corner.
You're really working on your radio.
That's right.
Thing, aren't you? Yeah.
Well, I like the Bigfoot thing because it's so freaking ridiculous to me. But maybe you'll change my mind.
Man.
You might change my mind. I don't know anything about it, so I'm going into the Bigfoot thing with a pretty closed mind. But I'm going to try to open it up, and you're going to convince me with this Patterson film thing you keep talking about.
You haven't seen that?
Yeah, I saw the Patterson film back when I was a kid.
That's going to be your assignment then.
Okay.
I'm going to do the legwork on this one.
Yeah. My assignment is just to watch the Patterson film.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it.
And to open your mind for a change.
I'll do my best, man. I'll do my best.
All right, so that's it. Yeah, next week we're going to be doing Bigfoot. With that being said, this is Stephen Hawk. I am signing out, and I'll see you next week.
Jimmy Co. Ditto. That's all for this week's episode of Cosmic Sponge. Please don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have any questions or have a story you'd like to share, you can contact us using our email account, firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.